I was 34 years old, sitting in my father's study with a glass of water I hadn't touched, when he looked me dead in the eye and said the inheritance was already gone. Not stolen, not lost, given away by him, while he was very much alive, very much breathing, very much sitting across from me in his leather chair like he hadn't just detonated a bomb in the middle of my chest. And before I could even open my mouth to ask the question that was screaming behind my teeth. To who, Dad? Who did you give it to? The doorbell rang. My father didn't even flinch. He just smiled, this small, tired, knowing smile, and said, "That'll be the bank." If you've ever had the floor disappear from under you in your own childhood home, you already know the sound that fills your ears in that moment. It's not silence. It's a kind of static, a buzzing that drowns out everything except the worst-case scenario. Your brain is building in real time. I stood up so fast my chair scraped against the hardwood floor like a scream. My father didn't move. He just watched me with those pale gray eyes that used to read me bedtime stories, the same eyes that were now studying my reaction like I was a stranger he'd just met at a funeral. Stay with me, because what happened next in that hallway changed everything. I thought I knew about family, loyalty, and the quiet, patient cruelty of people who smile while they ruin your life. If stories like this hit something real in you, subscribe now, because by the end of this, you're going to want to know exactly how far betrayal can go before it finally turns on itself. My name doesn't matter right now. What matters is that I had spent the last 6 years of my life rebuilding everything my father's business had cost our family. He ran a regional logistics company, 3 warehouses, 40 employees, a name that meant something in our town. I was supposed to inherit it. Not someday, soon. He'd told me that since I was 19 years old, standing in warehouse 2 with sawdust on his boots, telling me, "Son, this is going to be yours. Every brick of it." I believed him the way you believe gravity, not because you've tested it, but because you've never had a reason not to. So when he sat me down that Tuesday evening and told me flatly, without ceremony, that he had already transferred the majority of the company's assets, not to me, not to my mother, not even into some trust, but into the name of a woman I had never heard of, my entire understanding of who my father was collapsed into rubble, a woman named Marisol Ferreira. I asked him who she was. He just looked at his hands and said, "You'll understand soon enough." And then that doorbell rang, and a man in a gray suit with a leather folder walked into our living room like he owned it, because in a way he did. The bank manager's name was Dale Whitcomb, and he had the kind of practiced calm that told me immediately this wasn't his first time delivering devastating news to people who thought they understood their own lives. He set the folder on the coffee table, and my father poured him a glass of scotch like they were old friends closing out a golf game. I sat there, my pulse hammering in my throat, watching the 2 of them exchange pleasantries, while my future sat inside that leather folder, already decided, already signed, already gone. Here's what I need you to understand before I go further, because this is the part most people get wrong when they imagine stories like this. My father wasn't a monster in the obvious sense. He didn't drink. He didn't yell. He went to church every Sunday and shook every hand on his way out. He was the kind of quietly devastating man who could dismantle your entire life with the same gentle tone he used to ask about your day. And that night, with Dale Whitcomb sipping scotch across from me, my father finally told me the truth, the real story behind Marisol Ferreira, and why every dollar I thought belonged to me had already been signed away to a woman my father had been secretly supporting for almost 15 years. She wasn't his mistress. That would have almost been simpler, almost easier to carry. No, Marisol was the daughter of a man named Hector Ferreira, my father's former business partner, the man who had co-founded the company with him 30 years ago before dying in a warehouse accident that the official report called equipment failure. My father had never told me the full story, only fragments, only the parts that painted him as the grieving survivor, instead of what he actually was, the man who walked away from that accident with full ownership of a company that should have been split 50-50, while Hector's widow and infant daughter were left with a settlement check that barely covered a year of groceries. For 15 years, my father had been quietly funneling money to Marisol, tuition, rent, medical. bills when her mother got sick. He called it guilt money in his own head, I think. A private penance he never told anyone about, not my mother, not me, not a single soul, until the night he decided that guilt had finally outgrown its hiding place and needed to come out into the daylight wearing a suit, sitting in our living room with a bank manager as its witness. I want you to imagine what that feels like. Not the money, and forget the money for a second. Imagine learning in the same 5 minutes that your father has spent your entire adult life lying to your face about why he was always a little distant in October, why he disappeared every few months for unexplained business trips, why he flinched whenever someone said the word accident. Imagine learning that the company you'd given your 20s to, the warehouses you'd bled for, the promotions you'd earned, through nights you didn't sleep, none of it had ever fully belonged to the family you thought you were building it for. It had been quietly, deliberately set aside for someone else since before you even knew her name. And now, with the stroke of a pen and the witness of a stranger in a gray suit, it was hers. Officially, legally, permanently. If you're feeling that tightness in your chest right now, that's exactly the feeling I want you sitting in. Because what happens in the next part of this story is the part nobody sees coming. Not even me. And I lived it. So if this story has its hooks in you already, drop a comment right now with one word: betrayal. I read every single one, and trust me, by the end of this video, you're going to have a lot more to say than that. Dale Whitcomb left an hour later, and the house went quiet in that particular way houses go. Quiet after something irreversible has happened inside them. My mother came home from her sister's place not knowing any of it yet, and I watched my father's face change the instant her key hit the lock. That same gentle, practiced calm sliding back over him like a mask he'd worn so long he'd forgotten it wasn't his real face. I didn't say anything that night. I went home to my apartment, sat on my kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets, and didn't cry. I just sat there doing math, running numbers, trying to figure out what 15 years of silence costs a person when it finally comes due. But here's where the story turns, and here's the part I think you came for, because betrayal like that doesn't just break something in you, and it sharpens something too. I didn't sleep that night. I spent it instead going through old files, old emails, old shipping records from the warehouse, things I had access to as the company's operations manager that my father had clearly forgotten I could still see. And buried in a decade-old folder of digitized records, I found something my father never expected anyone to look for. Because he never expected anyone to know there was something to look for at all. The original incorporation documents from when the company was founded, listing Hector Ferreira not as a junior partner, not as an employee, but as a 40% equity holder, a percentage that had quietly, illegally, vanished from every subsequent filing after his death. I sat with that document for 2 days before I did anything. I want to be honest with you about that, because this isn't a story about a clean, righteous hero riding in to fix everything overnight. I was angry. I was grieving a version of my father that had never actually existed. And for 2 days, I genuinely considered burning the evidence and walking away from all of it, the company, the money, the family, just to never have to look my father in the eye again. But then I thought about Marisol, a woman I had never met, who had grown up without a father because of an accident that conveniently erased her family's rightful ownership, who had spent her whole life on the receiving end of guilt money instead of the inheritance that was actually hers by law. And I realized the real injustice in this story wasn't that my father had given something away. It was that he had spent 30 years deciding, quietly and alone, who deserved the truth and who didn't. So I made a call. Not to a lawyer, not yet. To Dale Whitcomb, the bank manager, the man who had sat in our living room sipping scotch like a man who already knew more than he was letting on. And it turned out he did. Dale had been the one handling the Ferreira settlement for over a decade. He told me carefully, in the measured tone of a man who knew exactly how much liability sat in every word, that he had personally flagged irregularities in the original equity transfer years ago, but my father had quietly paid to keep the filing buried. Dale wasn't proud of staying quiet that long, but Dale also wasn't going to stay quiet anymore. Not when the daughter of his oldest, Most overlooked client was finally about to get a knock on her own door. What followed over the next 3 weeks wasn't loud. There was no courtroom scene, no dramatic shouting match in a marble hallway. It was quieter and honestly more devastating than that. I helped Marisol's attorney reconstruct the real ownership, history of the company using the documents I'd found. I watched my father's face the day he was served, not with anger, not even really with vengeance, but with this strange, hollow grief. Because the truth was, exposing him didn't feel like winning. It felt like finally being allowed to stop pretending. I didn't see the cracks in the man I'd spent my whole life trying to become. The settlement that followed restructured the company's ownership entirely. Marisol received the 40% that had always legally been hers, plus damages for 15 years of buried filings. My father kept a minority stake and stepped down from daily operations. Not exiled, not destroyed, but finally, for the first time in 30 years, made to sit inside the consequences of a choice he'd made when he was young enough to believe he could outrun it forever. And me? I didn't inherit the company the way I always assumed I would. I inherited something else instead. Operational control, earned not through blood but through the only thing my father had never been able to buy his way out of the truth. Finally sitting in full daylight, owned by everyone it was always supposed to belong to. I met Marisol for the first time at the settlement signing. She didn't hate me. She didn't even hate my father. Not really, she just looked tired. In the specific way people look tired after carrying a question their whole life that finally got answered. We didn't become friends. We didn't need to. We just shook hands like two people who had both in our own ways. Spent our lives quietly inheriting somebody else's unfinished guilt, and were finally putting it down. I still talk to my father, carefully, slowly, the man who raised me and the man who buried a decades-old theft under guilt money and good manners are the same person, and I haven't fully figured out how to hold both of those truths in my hands at once. Maybe I never will. But I know this much. Inheritance was never really about the money. Not for him and not for me. It was about who gets to decide what truth survives long enough to be passed down, and who finally has the courage to stop letting silence do the deciding. If this story moved something in you, tell me in the comments which moment hit hardest, the doorbell, the documents, or the handshake at the end. Because I read every single one of them, and your stories shape what I tell next. Subscribe if you want more real, raw, unforgettable stories like this one. Hit that notification bell so you never miss the next reveal, and stay close. Because the next story I'm telling you is even darker than this one, and trust me, you do not want to miss how it ends.